April 11th, 1945. New Amsterdam, the Netherlands. A column of soldiers moved quietly along the canal road. They were Canadian, from the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division. They had crossed into the Netherlands 3 weeks earlier, grinding northward through flooded fields and broken bridges. They had seen burning farmhouses. They had buried their dead beside roads that had no names. They thought they had already seen the worst of it. They were wrong. By April 1945, the war in Europe was entering its final convulsions. Allied armies were pressing in from the west and the east, and the German military machine, though fractured and desperate, had not yet stopped killing. In the Netherlands, German occupation forces still held significant territory in the north, and the SS, in particular, had grown more savage as defeat became inevitable. Retreating units looted, destroyed, and executed without hesitation. The unit moving along the canal road that morning was led by Sergeant Edmund Brackey, the 31-year-old from Hamilton, Ontario. He was not a man given to sentiment. He had survived Normandy, the Scheldt, and the brutal winter fighting along the German border. He wore his exhaustion quietly, the way men do when they have run out of words for it. Before we dive in, I want to know, where are you listening to this story from? Drop your city or country in the comments right now, and let's see which corner of the world has the most war legend fans. Don't just scroll. Type it out. Your comment might get featured in the next story. His patrol, 8 men in 2 vehicles, had been tasked with a simple reconnaissance. They were to confirm that the road into New Amsterdam was clear of enemy resistance before the main column advanced. Command expected nothing unusual. German forces in this sector were believed to be falling back in disorder. It was, on paper, a routine morning, but there was nothing routine about the figure they saw standing in the middle of the road, a quarter-mile outside the village. He was an old man, perhaps 65, perhaps older. He wore a dark coat, mud-caked to the knee, and he held both arms raised above his head. His face was pale and rigid with fear, but his eyes were steady. He was not fleeing, he was waiting. Braque ordered the vehicles to halt. He dismounted with 2 soldiers, weapons raised, and approached slowly. The smell of the bog was heavy in the air, damp peat, standing water, something faintly burnt beneath it. The village was perhaps 200 meters ahead. A church spire rose above the roofline. No smoke from any chimney, no sound of birds. The old man did not move as the Canadians approached. When Braque was close enough, the man spoke in Dutch, then switched, haltingly, with effort, to German, then to broken fragments of English. "In the church," he said. "There are people hidden in the church. Germans are coming back. SS, you must hurry." Braque studied the man's face for a long moment. Then he turned and looked at the village. The street was empty. The shutters were closed on every window. The silence was not the silence of abandonment. It was the silence of people holding their breath. The old man's name was Hendrik Vos. He had been the village schoolteacher before the war. What he explained in the next 2 minutes, gesturing, stumbling between languages, his hand shaking, was nearly impossible to absorb in the time he gave it. For 7 months, the people of New Amsterdam had been concealing Jewish refugees in the crypt beneath the Reformed church at the center of the village. 43 men, women, and children transferred in small groups from hiding places further south as the German net had tightened. The network that had sustained them, food, documents, silence, had been built by the village's residents at extraordinary personal risk. 3 days earlier, an SS Sicherheitsdienst's unit had passed through, conducting searches. They had not found the crypt, but they had left 2 men behind, billeted in the house of a farmer at the edge of the village, with orders to watch for suspicious activity, and they were expected to return that morning with reinforcements. Voice had waited at the road because he had nowhere else to go. He had waited because there was nothing left to do but wait and hope that the Canadians would arrive before the SS did. Braque called his corporal, a laconic Manitoban named Roy Deschamps, to his side. He relayed what Vos had told him. Deschamps listened without expression, then looked down the road toward the village and back at Braque. "How many SS?" Deschamps asked. 2 confirmed billeted in the village. "Vos doesn't know how many are coming back. And the main column is how far behind us. 40 minutes, maybe more." The bridge at the crossroads was soft. The calculation was simple and horrible. 8 men moving into a village of unknown enemy strength. No armor, no artillery support, radio contact uncertain. Against that, 43 people in a church crypt who might be discovered at any moment. One of the younger soldiers, A private named Luc Girard, barely 20, who had volunteered from a farm in Quebec, said what the others were thinking. If the SS come while we're in there, we're caught in the open. Nobody disagreed. Nobody suggested turning back either. Some calculations are not really calculations at all. Braca told Voss to stay with the vehicles. Then he motioned to his men and moved toward the village at a quick walk. No one spoke. Their boots on the wet road were the only sound. They entered the village in two groups, moving along opposite sides of the street. The shuttered windows told Braca everything. The residents knew they were there, and they were staying inside. Whatever happened next, the village had made its choice long before the Canadians arrived. The church doors were unlocked. Inside, the air was cold and smelled of old stone and candle wax. The wooden pews were empty. A woman, young, perhaps 30, wearing an apron as though she had just come from a kitchen, emerged from a door behind the altar. She looked at the uniforms, and something in her face went slack with a relief so acute it resembled grief. She led them to the crypt entrance beneath the sacristy, a trapdoor, concealed beneath a heavy wooden cabinet that required 3 men to move. Braca descended first. What he found in the crypt was something he would spend the rest of his life unable to fully describe. The space was low and vaulted, lit by a single oil lantern. Blankets had been arranged in careful rows along the stone floor. People sat or lay in the dimness, some asleep, some watching the latter with eyes that held no expression that Braque had a name for. Children were among them, pressed close to adults. A very old woman sat upright against the far wall with a prayer book open in her lap, her lips moving silently. No one spoke. No one moved. They had been in hiding so long that the arrival of strangers, even strangers in the right uniforms, did not immediately translate into safety. Survival had trained them to be still. Then, from above, Deschamps's voice came down through the trapdoor, flat and controlled. Vehicle, Sarge. East Road. 2, maybe 3. The room below the church went rigid. Braca climbed back up in 4 steps. 2 vehicles were visible, perhaps 300 meters away, moving at speed. A Kubelwagen and a truck, its bed filled with soldiers. What followed in the next 11 minutes would be, by any conventional measure, a small engagement. A skirmish on a minor road in a village that appeared on no operational map of significance. 2 soldiers at the church windows. 2 more at the junction to the north. 1 behind the stone wall of the churchyard. Braque in the doorway of a house opposite. Radio pressed to his ear, calling the main column forward with a calm in his voice that he did not feel. The SS vehicles slowed as they entered the village. Whoever commanded them sensed that something was wrong in the quality of the silence. The Kubelwagen stopped. A figure emerged from the passenger seat, scanning the street. The first shot was fired by Deschamps from the church window when the officer raised a weapon. After that, the engagement was brief and violent and did not last long enough for the Canadians to be outflanked. 3 SS soldiers were killed. 4 surrendered when it became clear that they were not facing a patrol, but the forward edge of an advancing column. The sound of armor could already be heard on the southern road. The bridge had held, after all. Girard was grazed along the forearm by a rifle round. It was the only Canadian casualty. When it was over, the village of New Amsterdam came out of its houses. It happened slowly. A door opened here. A face appeared in a window there. Then the street was full of people who had been waiting, for months, some of them, in a state of prolonged and terrible vigilance, for the war to pass. The refugees came up from the crypt one at a time, blinking in the gray April light. Some wept, some did not. A few stood entirely still in the open air, as though they had forgotten what it felt like to be above ground with nowhere to hide. Braque stood beside the church and watched. He was a practical man, and the war had made him more so. He was not accustomed to moments that required something other than practicality. He found, standing there in the mud of a Dutch village on a cold April morning, that he did not quite know what to do with what he was seeing. Girard sat against the church wall, holding a field dressing to his arm and watching the same scene. After a long time he said, to no one in particular, 43. Nobody responded. There was nothing to add. Hendrik Vos found Braque at the edge of the street and held out his hand. Braque shook it. Vos said something in Dutch that Braque could not understand. The woman from behind the altar translated later, when the column had arrived and the machinery of liberation had begun its work. She said that Vos had told him, "We kept them alive, and then you kept us alive. That is all there is to say." The liberation of New Amsterdam was not recorded in any regimental history. The engagement generated a single line in the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division's operational log for April 11, 1945. Patrol contact, minor resistance, no significant casualties. The 43 people brought out of the church crypt appeared in no report at all. What the network in New Amsterdam had built over 7 months was, in the architecture of the Holocaust resistance, a small but extraordinary thing: the people who sustained it. Farmers, teachers, a pharmacist, the wife of a Protestant minister, a 14-year-old boy who ran messages between safe houses, did so under conditions in which discovery meant death, not merely for themselves, but for every person they were concealing. That the network was never compromised was a function of extraordinary discipline and extraordinary trust. The 43 who survived the crypt were transferred to processing centers in liberated Dutch territory within days. Some had been in hiding for more than 2 years. Several had lost family members to deportations before their own concealment was arranged. Sergeant Edmund Brackay returned to Hamilton, Ontario in December 1945. He worked for 30 years in a hardware business and rarely spoke about the war in any specific terms. His son, interviewed decades later, recalled that his father kept a single photograph on his workbench: a low stone church in a flat landscape, gray sky above it, no caption on the back. War, in its official remembrance, tends toward the large and the decisive. The campaigns, the surrenders, the columns of figures measuring territory gained and lives lost. But much of what the war actually was lived in moments like this one: a schoolteacher standing in a fog-covered road with his arms raised, a sergeant making a calculation that was not really a calculation, the sound of a trapdoor being lifted, people blinking in gray light. The residents of New Amsterdam, who maintained that network for 7 months, were not soldiers. They were not trained for any of it. They were people who had decided, each one separately and then together, that there was something they could not bring themselves not to do. And in the space created by that decision, 43 people survived a machinery that had consumed millions. History, at this scale, is not made of maps and maneuvers. It is made of the choices that ordinary people make in the dark, with no certainty of outcome and no audience but their own conscience. Edmund Brack never considered himself a hero. He thought he had simply arrived in time. What he may not have fully understood was that others had been arriving in a different way for 7 months before him. And that, too, is the war.